Welcome back to Social Impact Live. I'm your host, Darrell Coleman, looking forward to continuing our series today on the 5 mistakes that reduce the impact of social enterprises. Today we're going to wrap up this series with the 5th rule, and I want to talk to you a little bit about what the other 4 were before this. So the very first mistake that I said that social enterprises make is not really understanding directly and being in community with the people that they serve in order to understand the depth of the need that is actually present, as well as the nuances of how that need manifests in real people's lives. It's this thing where we serve theoretical people and we end up creating theoretical solutions to theoretical problems. That is the number one challenge that I see for people. The second is that we don't have a consistent way of maintaining that relationship with those communities and constantly getting updates. So that was rule number 2, or mistake number 2, that I talked about on this series as well. The third mistake was not having a clear end state in mind and knowing where you're really going with the solution that you're creating, making sure that you've pinned down the right issue. Not to say that the problems that people are solving, social enterprises are addressing, aren't real problems, but the depth and the specificity of the challenge we can find is very specific once you get to know the people who are experiencing it, as well as the many different people who are experiencing it, and you try to tie those experiences into a common outcome goal where possible. The fourth mistake that I mentioned was clinging too tightly to a given idea, coming into a situation and saying, I know what the solution is, and I'm still holding on to this idea really tightly, even though it might not be the best thing to actually solve the problem that you're working to address. And then the fifth rule, the fifth mistake that I see that social enterprises make whenever trying to create social change that limits the level of impact they can create is the speed of implementation of solutions once they have found something that they want to try out. The speed of testing, the speed of iteration, really, that slows them down. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Often, whenever an organization comes up with an idea for what it wants to address, whether it's an idea that they've just been holding on to for a really long time, or it's an idea that came through this process of understanding the community and defining a specific challenge and then actually, developing initiatives for that. No matter where the idea come from, what we need to recognize is that before that idea is put into action, before it's put into motion, it is just an idea. It is not real yet. It hasn't been tested by the real world. It hasn't been pushed back on by the real world. It hasn't encountered the challenges that physical reality creates whenever we put an idea into motion. And so what happens whenever we turn that idea into a pilot, for example, is that we decide that we're going to turn it into something that meets reality. But a lot of times, the time horizon that we give the idea in order to run and to test it is too long in order to get to the answers we need. I see this often with government clients of ours at DC Design. We will come in and they will say, yeah, we ran a pilot for this particular action or this particular initiative. The pilot lasted a year, for example. The results that we found after the course of that year weren't super conclusive or weren't very favorable. So now we need to figure out a new pilot to run. It usually takes several months. Maybe it's 4 months, maybe it's a year itself to set up the pilot in the first place, and then to run the pilot is another year. So what you're looking at is around 2-year cycles in order to get ideas out there each time a new idea is tested. We also find that, especially for governments, there are these election cycles that disrupt the ability for continual change to happen. And so one of the big things that we have learned, both for, again, government clients, but also for other social enterprises, those that are smaller, nonprofits, etc., is that the cycles, the iterative cycles, need to be shortened dramatically in order to figure out which solution makes the most sense and which solution makes the most sense in a more rapid fire way. So generally what I say in this phase, in this step here, is to hold on to ideas lightly, recognize that they haven't been tested truly, and figure out what is the key thing that we need to test in order to make sure that this idea is going to work. And can we scale the testing along a more known path in order to get to the place we want to get to, but do that a lot faster than the sort of 1-year pilot might allow us to get there. Run more iterations, more loops of the test, right, over and over. Because the reality is, each time you test something new, each time you run one of those loops, you're going to learn new things. You're going to modify your solution slightly. You're going to tweak it slightly. And it's those tinkerings, those modifications, those changes that you're making to it. Or maybe you even have to switch to a completely new idea 2 or 3 times before you get to the right one. It's those changes that are going to end up producing the difference between an idea that moves the needle and really creates the results that you're looking for and the other ones. So how do you actually do this? How do you reduce these cycles? What's a framework that you can put in place to really think about it? Well, here's a framework that we use and that we found to be effective. The first is to recognize that there are different levels of testing, and those levels correspond to different energy amounts as well as sizes of population. So let's imagine that you are creating a solution to reduce bias, right? Reduce the transmission of bias, reduce racial bias transmission in big data. This is actually a project that I'm working on right now. And so, I get to work with some really incredible partners on this work. And one of the ways that we've thought about the testing cycles is to move it through 4 different phases. So the first phase of this cycle, we're reducing, racial bias in big data, right? So big data researchers, they do a bunch of things. They pull in a bunch of numbers, for example. But where do those numbers come from? Where was the data taken from? Did the data have racial data in it in the first place? Did it have a representative sample of all the people in the country that fit a certain description for a given medical issue, for example? Those are questions we need to ask. So we're developing a tool that addresses that. Tier 1 testing, the first phase of testing, is really to take that idea, whatever that idea might be for you. In this case, it's this big data reduction tool, and just do a role play of what that might look like. So you gather a bunch of people together and you say, let's actually role play through what it might look like for this tool to be implemented. So here is my piece of cardboard, for example. Here is my drawing of my app and my interfaces, and it's going to ask you a series of questions. You're going to come in. So that person plays that role. You maybe have a few questions on a piece of cardboard written out, and you get to walk through what that experience might be like. This is going to teach you all sorts of things about your assumptions in the first place for that tool, where it should be positioned, who it should actually target, why are they filling it out in the first place. It's going to start to situate whatever you've created in time and space in a way that answers a ton of questions you need to answer, but answers them early and answers them quickly and answers them cheaply as well. So that's your first one. You do a role play. You gather people who you know. They don't even need to be necessarily the people that you're trying to serve just yet, together to act out what it would be like to go through a solution. And in this phase, you're using cardboard boxes, you're using pieces of paper, you're using sketch prototypes and all sorts of things. I was looking around to see if I had one here as an example. But you don't have to have a super high fidelity design yet. All right. The second tier of your testing is to test with real people. So you are actually going to take your idea a little bit further now. You're going to develop it into something people can directly interact with, and you're going to now start testing that out with the real population that you want to serve. But the test is really small scale, so you're just getting their idea, their feedback on the idea overall. So you might even take them through this sort of simulated role play that we're talking about. You're building it out a little bit more as you go though, but you're progressing from people who are close to you, who can give you sort of a gut check on, I got all these questions if I'm role playing, to these are the actual folks. But it's not a very big group of folks. It's 3 to 5 individuals, right? And so you're going to test in that regard as well. The next tier is your sort of tier 3, and somewhere between tier 2 and tier 3, you want to build something that's functional. You want to create something that's functional. So let me use a different example. Let's imagine that you are a social enterprise and you are, delivering meals to the homeless. That's what your enterprise is. So your very first test was going to be a role play where someone actually goes through and says, okay, you're going to be the individual who's homeless, and I recognize that that is something that you need to take very seriously. It's not something that you're supposed to play tongue-in-cheek with. It is okay, it is possible to do this role play and to gain valuable information from it without over politicizing or dramatizing or being offensive in that position. Recognize that it is all assumption at this point, and you are trying through intention to learn something good, right? So you'd have someone role play, right, as an individual who's going to receive these meals, and then you would have, here's what our service is going to work like, and that's going to produce a whole bunch of questions very, very quickly and very low cost. Ideally, you actually have those individuals involved and in the room the entire time, but if that's not possible, if they're not part of your team just yet, then you have to do this role play method. So that's number one. Number two is that you will then build out something really basic, and you say, okay, we're working with individuals. These are people we've come to know. Good thing that we gained all this inspiration, all these insights, all these relationships, right, that we formed with our community in the first place. So it's not very hard for us to find the people that we actually want to deliver these meals to in the first place. And you're going to go and you're going to work with them to understand, hey, how do you think about this model if we were, to launch this initiative? What would be your thoughts or your questions? What are the things that we have wrong within the model? Somewhere between tier 2 and tier 3, as you're delivering food to the homeless, you need to build out something that's actually going to do that work. And so that means that you can say, okay, for 1 week, we're going to do this for this small group of people, and we're going to actually get the food, we're going to bring it in, we're going to package it up, we're going to deliver it to those individuals, we're going to test how that works on our side, how that works on their side, what were the problems we ran into, who was hard to find, who was easy to find, where were they located, which meals were necessary for them, which ones weren't necessary, etc. And that is what your test is going to be. For your tier 3 test, as you go, you can see that we're sort of scaling up, we're answering a bunch of questions as we go. For your tier 3 test, you are going to then deploy this on a more ongoing fashion for a greater number of people, whatever that might look like. So let's imagine that it's a 3-month period, and that now you are delivering meals to 100 individuals, right? And that's your goal, or 100 individuals who show up for a given delivery for your specific service. And so that's how you're going to scale that. That's going to be your pilot. So now you see what we've done is that we've gone from, maybe we spent a month between the tier 1 and tier 2 where we were first role playing and then actually talking with people who have been through this situation, assuming they're not a part of your team, which I always recommend that they are. Then we spent another 3 months actually testing something that we feel pretty good about because we've got great feedback along the way. We've iterated, we've tweaked it along the way. We've got great feedback. So we spent 3 months now testing this next level solution and getting feedback on how that works. And then once we've done that, we can take that information, we can scale it up as necessary, and we can make that our bigger test overall. But we moved from being a year to test one time to being 4 months to test 3 to 4 times. And the reality is that you can run those low-level tests, the role play and the conversation role play with folks who have been impacted by whatever system it is that you're working to address. You can run that over and over again, and you can actually do 7 tests or 8 tests during that time period as well. One thing that I think is really important to emphasize, that's sort of heavy for me right now, is that this community piece is so important. If you are coming from the outside and you're saying, hey, I've got a solution for a community that I'm not a part of, that's challenging. It's challenging to be in that situation. It's challenging to think that you can come from the outside and actually address an issue for people who you don't know and you haven't experienced what they've experienced. And this is where I can't emphasize enough rule number 1 and mistake number 1 that I see people make. If you are not in community with the individuals that you serve, if you are not creating something that is going to, if you don't have direct relationships with those individuals, then your role play is likely not going to make much sense because it's going to be a caricature. If you don't have those relationships, it's going to be hard for you to move into the next phase where you are working directly with those individuals. If you don't have those relationships, it's going to be hard for you to bring those people onto your team. If you happen to be the catalyst for this idea, which sometimes happens, sometimes people are able to use their power and their privilege and their resources in some way and bring those together to say, hey, let's address an issue that others have but don't have the resources to address. It's okay for you to be that person. But if you don't have those relationships, you can't form a team, a common team where the individuals who have been impacted are part of that team. And so you need to make sure, of all the mistakes on this list, mistake number 1 is the biggest one that I see, the lack of relationship. It is the biggest reason that these initiatives will fail. It is the biggest reason that you're going to end up working in isolation. And you'll see that, mistake number 2 builds on top of it, mistake number 3, mistake number 4, and mistake number 5. If you don't have that one, you can't even get the other ones right. And also, you're going to possibly end up doing more harm than good in the first place. So, those are the 5 mistakes that reduce the impact of social enterprises. I'd love to hear your comments on these and, just learn from you about what's worked for you in your journey and what hasn't worked for you in your journey as well as what else you'd like to learn about. This is Social Impact Live, a series where I'm always giving new frameworks and tips for how to increase your social impact in the world and create meaningful change. That is my goal, is to help catalyze the realization of ambition, and that means helping people achieve their dreams, some of which comes from helping you help them achieve their dreams also. So I will be back tomorrow with another episode. If you thought this was useful, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you soon.